Hey guys, it's Mathwell here once again with yet another Build League review video. This time around for Sanctum League, which as a league, personally, I think it may have been my favorite league. It was just very satisfying to play. The mechanic was really nice once you got into it, pretty in depth. I like roguelikes as well, but overall it was just like a good league mechanic that stayed fresh for the few months that we played it for. It was a long league though, so it got extended to 4 months. Played it for about 2 months, did 14 builds. Then I'm going to review throughout this video, which might take about an hour, something like that. As always, small rating system that goes into it that is based off of like enjoyment, budget, starter, something like that. Don't take it too seriously. It really doesn't mean anything other than just comparing for comparison's sake and giving slight reviews on each build. Essentially, just having a recap of the builds, and I think this league was some pretty special builds here or there. Definitely some very different things that possibly haven't done before. In any case, let's get into it, and the first build was nothing too crazy. This league, they did introduce a whole bunch of new Varl skills for melee attacks and a couple other things as well, and I really wanted to try out Varl Venom Gyre. So ended up building a fairly simple, not too complicated Trickster using a Binos knife, which was also buffed, and used Varl Venom Gyre in it. So it was a fairly basic poison build that used Cobra Lash for leveling, then went into Venom Gyre. Once it scales well enough, Venom Gyre becomes one of the premier claw and dagger skills in the game. This one didn't go to the lengths that a proper Varl Venom Gyre could go. It was just a starter build that was supposed to function off of fairly low amounts of currency and just get us into maps, through a few bosses, etc., and then get ready for our second character. It was ultimately, I think, a little bit lackluster. I would have liked a bit more damage out of the build. I think it had something like 1 or 2 million poison DPS in the end, which is enough to get through your red maps and kill a few guardians and all that, but not really enough to feel good about doing it multiple times. So it got to like level 91, 92. It didn't cost almost anything to play, something that could be done very on the budget, but I still would have liked a bit more out of a starter. Varl Venom Gyre, however, was a bit of a winner. It was a good Varl skill, like pretty much all of the Varl additions, but it was a good Varl skill. It let you Whirling Blade around a lot more than you otherwise would, as the Whirling Blade Venom Gyre mechanic is supposed to be interacted. Don't know why we're looking at so much fucking loot here. We did do the Sanctum boss on this character as well, and it went pretty well. It was decent for the Sanctum mechanic, but it got a lot better doing Sanctum with other builds. I thought I was okay with Sanctum on this character. I'm like, hey, I'm getting through it all right. It was a bit of a struggle here or there, but it was pretty bad compared to some of the other builds I ended up doing. It had a lot of ramp time, and on top of that, Whirling Blades with the Venom Gyre mechanic forced me to be like this kind of jank pseudo melee a lot of the time. So it wasn't ideal, but it was still good enough, because basically Sanctum was well and truly doable once you had some decent relics for it and you knew the mechanics of it. Basically with any roguelike, that's how it's going to be. It sucks until you have an established set of perks, gear, etc., and also the knowledge base for getting the Sanctums or the roguelike mechanics down. So yeah, that was the first character. That was a starter build, and we got to give that one some ratings. So the effectiveness of it, overall, it was effective enough. For a starter, it did what it needed to do. It didn't go all the way into Ubers or anything like that, and it probably wouldn't without real gear. I'm going to have to give it something like a 7 for effectiveness. The enjoyment of it, with a bit more DPS, would have been a lot more fun, and also having to whirl through enemies for your big burst of damage when you don't have a huge burst of damage and you are a bit squish can take away some of that enjoyment. You really want the payload of that whirl to be huge when it comes to the Venom Gyre interaction, and this one was a little bit smaller. So the enjoyment of it overall, probably also a 7. It was still pretty damn fun and took me as far as I needed it to take me. Budget, can it be a starter? It was definitely budget viable, but it doesn't scale into infinite the way it was, so probably give that something like an 8. and that means it had a total of 22. The second build that I went with is, as always, for a second build you kind of want a little bit of established currency, was Smite and Vile Smite and Frozen Legion. Vile Smite was one of the new melee Vile skills that came into play, and I definitely wanted to try that one out, but heard plenty about it already by that point. On top of that, I wanted to do Frozen Legion to begin with, but lots of people were going with that, so I decided to do Vile Venom Gyre as a bit more of a test instead. But then this character came about because I figured I could use Smite and Vile Smite to kind of buff the damage of Frozen Legion and use it as a big one-shot instead of going through these clunky mechanics of trying to make Frozen Legion just work by itself, because it is a very weird skill to scale. But just to begin with, Vile Smite by itself, absolutely insane. It really blew me away with how powerful it was, especially at level 1. You can get it very early on, and it screen clears. Compared to almost everything else that takes a bit of time to ramp up and slowly gets better and more ranged and more area and all of that, Vile Smite right from level 1 can basically destroy an entire screen, and it is very efficient for clearing, especially while leveling. So then we comboed that with Frozen Legion to buff our Frozen Legion and just try and one-shot things while the Vile Smite and the Smite are doing most of the clear. I was using a fairly budget setup but with a few okay pieces of gear, and Frost Breath was the main player of the build, so it was doubling our damage while stacking all kinds of flat elemental damage. So instead of going for like a pure fizz perspective or something like that, or a pure cold perspective, I was an Inquisitor that stacked lots of different damage types and then used Frost Breath to double that damage against any chilled enemies. It did create a very slow attack speed sort of playstyle, which wasn't the best, and honestly, ultimately, I think I used a much faster weapon that hit way less hard for a lot of the mapping experience. Even though Frost Breath is pretty much best in slot for damage on this thing, especially on endgame, it just wasn't as fun as with a faster weapon. But Frost Breath is very cheap, and this was a very cheap character to kind of get to a decent enough point where it was hitting for like 20 million crits or some shit, and Vile Smite carried the area by a large margin on this build, but then Frozen Legion was doing all of the single target. So it was a bit of a mix and match, but you could easily go into pure Smite or pure Frozen Legion if you adjust accordingly. It was a pretty damn surprising build for what it was doing, and I was very pleased with playing it. So the effectiveness of the Smite, Frozen Legion, and Quiz, for how much it costs and the kind of playstyle for it, and as a second character, with how basic the setup was, I'd say its effectiveness was pretty good, like an 8. It was just a bit slow on the attack speed. It could take a bit of damage because it was using a replica Abyssus, I think it was. So it wasn't the most well-rounded, balanced character, but it took me pretty far. I think like level 95, level 94, and killed some endgame bosses. So it's pretty damn good. The enjoyment of it was high as well, but didn't love the slower attack speed. Like I said, had to fix that up a bit. But I'm playing with the new Vile skill, playing with the new skill. Pretty high on the enjoyment there as well. Probably give it an 8. Needed to go maybe a bit further as an overall package to have more enjoyability. And then can it be a starter? I did try and give Smite and Vile Smite as a starter for a champion setup. This one ultimately kind of similar, but I'd say it takes a little bit more on the gearing side. Take an Inquisitor of this type of caliber to a good damage level where it feels really good. Can it be a starter? Absolutely. Can it be a starter to get to the same level? It'll take you a while, but I'd say give that maybe a 6 as well. So overall, maybe a 22. Which doesn't feel quite right, 22 versus this and that. One was just a bit zoomier and way cheaper, but then the other one was a bit more effective, a bit slower, takes a bit more gear, and then they end at the same spot, but one was just, going to take you a lot further. So the ratings, whatever, don't worry about them. Next up on the list is what I thought was actually going to be an unbeatable build of the league because of just how freaking good it was while playing it, how good it felt, how good it looked, and how hipster it felt. And that is a revision to the Bow Flicker Strike cast on crit Inquisitor, but this time using the new revamped Voltaxic bow. It was basically just a cheaper attempt at what the previous build was, but it was full chaos with Voltaxic Rift instead of, I think, a tri-ele bow is what I was doing, but using Battle Mage, so taking all of the damage of the Voltaxic, its flat lightning, and then putting it on to your spells, and they're full chaos. So we're doing a full chaos version of Inquisitor, and it meant that we didn't need the extra Forbidden Flesh and Flame to take all of the passives from Inquisitor. We're calling it Bow Flicker Strike by having cast on crit and Asenath's chant using Lightning Warp. So instead of like proper Flicker Strike, where lightning warping all over the place, kind of looking like Flicker Strike, but a bow version. It had absolutely insane damage, it had really nice visuals, and it was super satisfying to play. It may have been one of the highest damage builds I'd played up to that point, I don't really remember. But the shocks were absolutely huge. Like you could see up to 105% shock because we were using the Voltaxic and scaling it to a high level of shock, and as well as that, I was then using something I hadn't used before, and that's Galvanic Field. So Galvanic Field is the big red circle that you can see here. That's with an MTX, and it's based off of shock values. So the prior league, or the league before, is when Galvanic Field came out, and it was written off by most people. Instead, Lightning Conduit was the big thing everyone was using, and they said Galvanic Field sucked. But I wanted to see it for myself this time around, and I think something about it changed this league as well, which is why it got better. Either way, gave it a shot, and holy fuck did it deliver. So the main tooltip, or the main, not tooltip, the main source of damage from the build was supposed to be arc from the Voltaxic bow and the cast on crit, but then so a lot of damage did come from Galvanic Field in the end. I wasn't sure exactly how much work it was putting in, but I chose to believe that it was doing quite a lot, and I kept using it. Either way, I think you can go without it, I think you can go with it. For the most part, it's just a combo of Voltaxic with what is in my opinion, like the strongest cast on crit versions out there, bow cast on crit, because you get to use Asenaths as a additional sort of proc system. It's not super hard to put together, but it's definitely not incredibly easy at the start of a league. It did take on, I think, all the Ubers and just shit on all content, and honestly felt really good to play. I played it for quite a while, like up to 95 or something. It was really good for Sanctum, really good for all bossing, but it was a bit squishier than the previous version I did, just because I wanted to max out damage a bit more. And yeah, look, I was very happy with the rework to Voltaxic in the end. I played it in another build that you'll see in a sec as well, but I was super happy with the bow, and couldn't sing its praises enough. I'm still not sure enough people took notice of it, and I think it was a bit underrated. So hopefully more Voltaxic action this coming league. So we could watch footage of it all day, but I do think we probably need to give it a rating, and it should be a high one. Like I said, I thought it was going to be build of the league until some other builds came along. The effectiveness overall, it was a 10. It cleared insane. It did insane clear damage. It cleared very well with the Lightning Warp, and it killed all bosses pretty damn well. So loved it. Enjoyment of it, that's a 10. Loved playing it. Just solid fun throughout the entire thing. It was a bit tough to put together, but that's part of the fun for me as well. A difficult to put together build and figure things out, but it was based off of an earlier template to some extent, so it wasn't that hard. But it was a lot of fun to play, enjoyment. I got to give that a 10. Can it be a starter? I mean, you can like do arc, just self-cast for a while, and then eventually turn it into a starter, right? It'd be tough, but it's doable. It's a bit of a weak, you know, starter. if you're going to go through cast on crit, but I don't think it's a very high budget. It could easily be a second character of a league. It could be something you transition into. Like, it's going to suffer some points here in the end, but I think it's still something like a 6 at the very least, because it's fully doable if you want to commit into something like this. Problem is, maybe Voltaxic will be more expensive at the start of this league, thanks to bow users and all that. But I think it's doable. Either way, this is more just talking about the budget of it. It's not a super high budget, but to fine-tune it, it does take a bit more currency to make it at the highest levels. So we give that a total 26. It's close to build of the league, honestly. Just ratings aside, it was just one of the most fun builds I'd played in the past few leagues. The next build up was Val Double Strike and Double Strike, aka the boys, and it is a build that didn't take any sort of new Val skills or anything too new or fancy from the league, but it's a concept I wanted to do for a while, and that is a full fire version of Double Strike using the Chieftain Namahu Flame, Namahu Advance, something like that. Notable, Ascendancy notable. And it's just Double Strike with Val Double Strike and the Savior, so you've got a lot of extra clones of yourself, and it's a full fire variant as a Berserker. So as a Berserker, you get a lot of attack speed, so we went pretty much maximum attack speed with Blitz charges, and scaled some flat fizz, so used a decent fizz weapon, a Savior, lots of flat fizz on gear, and you can see that with the right kind of combo of zoom, in this case Accelerating Shrine, Echo Shrine, you can have some of the zoomiest, dumbest gameplay in the game, like Headhunter Simulator. And I did use Behead Gem for a little bit of that Headhunter Simulator action, but it really doesn't do much except for give us some weapon range. It doesn't simulate Headhunter for shit. Overall, it was a pretty effective build. It's melee, which, you know, is supposed to be dead, but I think I played like 4 melee builds this league and enjoyed each one in their own way. And it had something like 20 million DPS, which was pretty respectable for how not super difficult it was to put together. That's just once again still showcasing the maximum attack speed of the build. It did pretty well for Sanctum, which by this point of the league, everyone was saying melee is super shit for Sanctum. It's not fair. And I wanted to try and prove that melee was well and truly doable for Sanctum, and it didn't matter that you're like point blank or strike range or anything like that. It's just a matter of like building for it, having a play style, getting a bit of strike range, a bit of attack speed. Overall felt pretty damn good. So it was the first good double strike build I'd done in a while, and I was happy with how it turned out. But there was nothing too special or fancy about it. It was just another double strike build, different way of scaling, a few other different moving parts. But for me to truly like really enjoy a build at the moment, it has to have some extra big different thing about it, something particularly special. So lots of good damage. Very fast character, not too hard to put together, but you know, my enjoyment hinges a bit more on how hipster it is these days. The effectiveness of it, overall, I'd probably have to give it like a 9. I think it killed all bosses, like even Ubers, a lot of the bosses, I think. It was really good for everything, but it was a bit squish, as an Abyssus Berserker typically will be, so it has to lose at least a point of effectiveness for that. Enjoyment, still pretty fun for a melee build. Like I said, for pure maximum enjoyment, I think it needs more hipsterness for me, but aside from that, it was pretty satisfying to leap around, kill stuff, be melee, and having clones of yourself do a lot of extra heavy lifting. That's always fun. And then, yeah, dying occasionally thanks to Abyssus, not terrific. So a few points of enjoyment gone. Can it be a starter? I think you can easily start Double Strike as a Berserker. The budget wasn't insane, but it definitely pays to have a more well-tuned, fine-tuned character. So I think we can still give that one maybe more of a 5. You certainly can't like start this version of it because it needs the Fire Chieftain node, but Double Strike Berserker, very easily startable, and will get you somewhere. Just not necessarily to the same spot until you've got a lot more gear. So that is Wouldn't you know it, a 20 fucking 2. The next build was quite possibly one of the most hipster creations I've ever made, and it was a difficult one to put together. But it was based around the concept of Echoforge, which was a new endgame item that came from Maven, I think, and no one really knew what to do with it, so this was my attempt at it, and it is Cast While Channel, Cyclone, into Reap, Poison, Trickster, Echoforge. So the idea behind the build is Echoforge had a lot of flat chaos on it, and a few other cool things like life, area, attack speed, something like that. But for a two-handed sword, you can't really utilize all of that for pretty much anything that a two-handed sword would want to do, like the skills. So I tried to think of ways to utilize it in other ways, cast on crit, cast while channel, and came up with doing Battle Mage, so a hat that lets you not crit, but gives you Battle Mage. So it's a very difficult item to use, and then converted like all of my fizz into chaos, and then did poison from Trickster. It's a lot to explain the build, honestly, as just a quick summary, because it is a just absolute mess of a build. But it turned out to be kind of something. It was a build that had very nice clear in the end. Cyclone, of course. Cast or Channel into Reap was doing really good things. I got some Occultist, not Occultist, but Chaos Pops that are similar to Occultist from the Cluster Jewels, and tried to increase my speed as much as possible for movement speed, attack speed, recovery, all of that, and then just make a smooth clearing build. Basically, it didn't have the best single target or the single target playstyle, so mostly ended up focusing on clear, I think. From memory, I think it hit like level 95 or some shit, and it went really well. Most replayed. Didn't know that was a thing for this video. Yeah, now that I see this part, I do remember we did some really juiced maps, and this character was basically carrying in its clear because it had good sustain, good movement speed, good AoE damage, and then I think that's pretty much all. Yeah, single target was a bit average. So as long as our momentum was high, it would keep going, keep exploding, keep clearing. Once you had to do some single target, it was a bit weird, especially with the targeting of the Reaps and the Cyclone. Like, you typically don't want your Reap to be going from melee range and all over the place. You want to target it a bit better, to overlap a bit better. But as you can see, it can still do some single target, and then, yeah, had to do this phase of the boss, which it could do. So it was a few million DPS, maybe like 5 to 10 mil, but it was more about the AoE clear. And it just proved viability of Echoforge, but I wasn't really recommending it as something people should copy, and it wasn't something I really wanted people to copy because it was difficult to put together. But proof of concept, basically. I just let myself go a bit wild with the build, and do what it needed to be done. Do what it takes, what it took to make a build come together, to make what was, I think, basically a shit item viable. So to give some ratings for this one, effectiveness, like, it cleared great, it bossed kind of crap, and then everything it needed to put together just wasn't really worth a good rating, I think. Maybe a 7. I mean, it mapped great. Let's just say that, for the most part. Enjoyment, I'd say the novelty of it was really high, but then playing it in the end was kind of just like, hey, it's a bit of a, you know, it's a bit of a Cyclone build. So I can't give it too much enjoyment, but it was novelty of putting it together, fun concept, and difficult to work out. I'd still give that like a 7. So then, budget, can it be a starter? It's just nothing, man. You can't start. I mean, you could play Poison Reap as a Trickster, and then eventually transition into Echoforge or something. But that's just not a thing. I'd have to give that like a 2 or something. Just because it can be done as like Poison Reap to begin with, and then eventually something. So that's a pretty damn low rating, and it does deserve a low rating, but it was a nice, fun proof of concept that should not be attempted. Next build after that was, I think, my second or third real attempt at mine builds. Pyroclast Mines. It is, once again, another pretty weird and hipster build for me anyway, but Pyroclast Mines, especially with Astral Projector, is something that people have played in the past. It just has fallen out of favor for, I think, quite a while now. I haven't really seen anyone give a shit about Pyroclast Mines for a long time. Essentially, Pyroclast Mines shoots out a bunch of little Pyroclast projectiles, but with Astral Projector, it means that they target where the enemy is. So it makes it a really sort of smart system, smart homing system that gives you much better range and clear. And single target can overlap a lot better with this because it'll basically target the boss or the mob instead of like around a certain area. Oh, that cringe Crypt Secret resub. So it was a really good character in the end for clear and for bossing, but it was a big playstyle adjustment for me, especially for endgame bossing in Ubers, because all of a sudden I've got to care about the left click or the detonate, as well as placing mines and also placing chains of mines. It's not just enough to place some mines and then some more mines. You got to care about like the chain to do more damage. It was a bit weird, but ultimately it was still a really nice build. It was, I think, the usual saboteur, but I tried to make it low life and max out the damage as much as possible because I had a Skin of the Loyal that could give me lots of gem levels. So I went with this one as a bit of a gonna try and make it work because no one cares about this sort of skill. More of a proof of concept once again, and I think it had like level 36 or some shit Pyroclast Mine. It ended up being pretty good, but still not too sure if it was worth copying for a lot of people or making work, since you can do better mine setups or better trap setups. Either way, it was a lot of DPS if you got the pre-fire and the preload against bosses, but that sort of playstyle falls off big time if you can't kill the boss in that first wave. So that's where Ubers came in and started to feel kind of bad. So as you can see, for like regular stuff, not too bad. But then you come across, Cirrus was still pretty decent. Come across like Maven, where you got to do a lot of setups and a lot of positioning, and it was an absolute nightmare. Especially because, as I said, it was a big playstyle adjustment for me trying to do different chains, and you could see just the mess that this Maven arena was. Overall, it was still a good build. It took me places. It came together as a full-blown build, and I think I killed almost every boss with it, as well as doing some good mapping with it. But I didn't really love the mine playstyle once again. I didn't hate it as much as I initially thought I would hate mine playstyles, but still far from my favorite for the future. Doubt I'm going to be doing too many mine builds, maybe once every couple leagues. The effectiveness overall, it mapped decent, but nothing too special. You know, it's a mine build. And bossing is pretty good, but nothing insane. Still better examples out there. Definitely pretty high though, an 8. The enjoyment of it, I didn't really love playing it. I loved, once again, putting it together was good, and I think I just enjoyed the concept, but piloting it, I mean, it's definitely some wrist damage and playstyle adjustments are not the best. Can it be a starter? I think you can start Pyroclast Mine, Icicle Mine, any of those mines pretty comfortably. To build into a character like this was definitely going to be a bit more of a requirement budget-wise. Its budget wasn't particularly small, so got to give that like a 4 or something like that, which gives us a result of 17. Next build up was yet another melee build, and it was one of the favorite builds I'd played in a while, especially as melee. So yeah, I mean, I just said that about Voltaxic, but there was a high amount of enjoyable builds this league. With Glacial Hammer here, it was very satisfying to just get these crunches. So it's Glacial Hammer with Varunastra as a Slayer. So the idea was to basically take Varunastra, which is something that got slightly buffed, honestly not in the way we would have wanted, but it was buffed enough that it gave me inspiration to look at it, and then use Heat Shiver, which a lot of people have been using for lots of high-end scaling, and I gave myself like kind of a permission to use it once or twice here or there, but I wanted to specifically go hard on a Glacial Hammer with it. And it really paid off. It was a super satisfying melee playstyle, which is pretty surprising for, you know, today's modern PoE. Usually melee builds can be pretty good up until bossing, the very highest end of bossing, Ubers, etc. But this one, I think, carried through all the way, even on Ubers. And for some reason, it just stood out above so many other melees. I think it's more just because the freezes and the really big hits. And then on top of that, it was a fairly well-rounded build. Given that you're using Heat Shiver, it means you're not using Abyssus, so you're not like taking a penalty for all that extra damage. And it became a well-rounded character, so I could focus a bit on defense as well as offense. And then seeing some of the really big crits against bosses was just satisfying. But on top of that, Glacial Hammer no longer has a threshold duel, so it lost its melee splash, but you can get melee splash throughout the tree now, and that basically covered for it. Get a few extra additional strikes, and then you got yourself a build that clears really well, freezes everything for extra defense. You get yourself some extra actual defense, as defensive as you want. I built moderately defensive to the point where I could take some hits for sure, but you can go way harder. And then it did some okay boss damage, and that meant that we could do a really well-rounded melee character. It's been a while since I last played Glacial Hammer as well, and then just on top of that, I was really happy with how the build turned out with Varunastra. So I haven't done a Varunastra in a long time, and we made it very competitive and viable. Thanks to the cluster jewel system, you can get cluster jewels that roll for like double weapon types and damage at the same time. Rolling enough of them that do enough increased damage just scales insanely. So it was actually a bit of a surprise how well it performed compared to other weapons. It would take a very big weapon to compete with Varunastra the way I ended up playing it, and yeah, it may have to happen again in the future. It was very worth building into. All you have to do is basically fix the crit and fix the attack speed, because it has just trash tier stats of both of those. So some of these crits were just some of the biggest I'd seen, maybe ever. As you can see, against enemies that can be frozen, which is almost everything, you have a very clean playstyle. So it starts to fall off once you go against uber bosses. They don't get like frozen and stuff, but you can theoretically freeze them, and that's the Feared, I think. Uber Elder and all that. You can see we can take some hits, but you're still a very melee playstyle, and that's where a melee playstyle starts to fall off. I think this was a Maven Uber Elder, so yeah, I was confident in my build's ability to like do all endgame content. There's not really too much else to say. I'm pretty sure it just was an absolute slapper of a build and was highly recommended. Wasn't even sure if I'd be calling it Build of the League. Maybe I was going to be. Either way, let's give it some ratings. I think it was going to be my Build of the League after the Bow Flicker Strike, but another one followed up after this anyway. Effectiveness, I think it was a 10. It was as good as it could have been. I mean, clear could have been a bit faster maybe, but it was still very effective clear, and bossing was very effective as well. The enjoyment, I had a lot of fun with this. Still melee, so you know it might be a bit frustrating in uber bosses, but overall I'd say it was almost peak enjoyment. And then budget, it's not super hard to put together. It's not super expensive, but more investment is going to pay off more. Varunastra's cheap, Heat Shiver's cheap. Like those were the main pieces of the build. But then the best clusters possible would get you the best results. I think it's still pretty cheap, pretty doable, and pretty budget. I'd give that maybe a 7. As always, a melee build, the more you put in, the more you get out. So it's not going to be ultimate cheapness. But that's a pretty good rating, I think, and fair at a 26. Next build up was yet another Voltaxic usage. I love the Voltaxic bow so much, I did want to play a proper hit-based build with it as well. And Lightning Arrow was still kind of fresh and new with a new MTX, and I played a Lightning Arrow a league or two before that, but it was a bad version. Like it was an attempt with the bad bow from Gluttonous Gluttonous Tide, I think it was called. So I gave myself a use of Lightning Arrow again, and it was with Voltaxic. I wanted to go a full Chaos sort of scaling thing, and Lightning Arrow still kind of has shit single target. Like, had maybe 10 million DPS with its full barrage setup. So we had to also lean on Storm Rain totems to help single target. And that seems to be a solution you can put into basically any bow build as far as I'm concerned. So League starting a bow build, if you're really struggling, you could easily just chuck some Storm Rain totems into that build. And as long as you're attacking pretty fast and ramping them with some extra arrows and stuff, it can carry single target on like any bow build. And yeah, that's basically what ended up happening. So I had something like 10 million DPS on the Lightning Arrow itself, which I was hoping was going to be the main draw of the build. But then the Storm Rain totems as a secondary ended up dealing like an extra 20 million. And this character was super speedy, had full chaos damage, and then at the end of the day was really good at single target against bosses as well, thanks to the speed it's got, thanks to the Storm Rain totems that you can see going off there. It completely destroyed bitrate, so it wasn't a super stream or video friendly build, but yeah, it should look better if you're playing it manually. If things are moving around, as you can see, it becomes pretty bad for Storm Rain totems because they place like their beams in a certain spot and then hope that things stand in them and just keep attacking. But most bosses have good periods of standing still from time to time. So that's the Fid. End up taking on all Ubers, I do believe, and plenty of bosses are standing around taking some damage. My god, that's 0 bit rate. So yeah, pretend you can see something and that I was like doing good damage. Had something like 30 million DPS. Really depends on if the boss is standing still well enough. But all there is to really say is, once again, another usage of Voltaxic and a very fast character as well. So we were running around very quickly. This should be a good example of some DPS. Running around very quickly, so it was still a squishy as fuck character, but it was entirely up to us to kind of move away from things with our super speed. Yep, 0 bit rate. Especially with the Sniper's Mark and the Lightning Arrow. So Lightning Arrow is going to have a Val version this time around, and hopefully that can help some single target, but like Storm Rain can carry either way. And on top of that, Voltaxic, still kind of underrated. So we'll have to wait and see how Voltaxic is for the new league. Maybe people don't play it, maybe they're still somewhat cheap, but I still highly recommend some Voltaxic action, and especially with the new Lightning Arrow. The effectiveness, say overall, that was pretty damn high. Being squishy, I think, has to take at least a point off, because you're going to be dying from time to time. I had a lot of evasion on the character, but not a huge life pool. So yeah, it might be a bit tough in some situations. For the most part, almost no deaths, you know, pretty much never dying. But it certainly can happen with that type of life pool and learning new mechanics. Enjoyment was pretty damn high. Still basically a Lightning Arrow build, so I don't love being a super speed character. I just straight up like enjoy a bit more meaningful combat. I know PoE basically doesn't have super meaningful combat at this point, but there are still levels to it, and being a headhunter turbo zoomer really isn't my cup of tea for more than a few maps, so it's a bit too fast sometimes, which takes away from my enjoyment, but I'd give that a 9 as well. Can it be a starter? You can start Lightning Arrow, you can start ramping into Voltaxic quite comfortably. I think this is actually a pretty decent build and high rated in that regard as well, so that gets a total of 25, I think. 9, 18, 7, 25. I think that works. Pretty good rating. The next build was quite possibly the smoothest Ignite build I can remember playing, and that is Explosive Concoction, but with Black Flame as an Occultist. It was an attempt at trying to be a bit hipster with Explosive Concoction. Once again, horrible bitrate, especially because of Eater of World mobs. But the core concept is that you run Explosive Concoction with all your flasks, a bunch of fire, cold lightning damage. In this case, it was an Occultist, so that Black Flame could scale really nicely through its chaos damage taken on enemies. And then I took the Elementalist Shaper of Flames passive so that all of my damage could ignite, thus using all of Explosive Concoction. I did one attempt at this type of build before as a pure Elementalist, but it was... let's see if I can get some better footage from the future. I don't think we do. A Cortex. Uber Cortex. Nah, the video quality is just always going to be bad, I think, for this one. So, you're going to have to just take my word that it cleared very nicely. But its single target was okay, and it was a different way of building defense as well to what I'm normally doing. So I use Incandescent Heart, a lot of max res, and then one of the Val Timeless Jewel defensives, which was called, let's double check real quick, if I can, Divine Flesh. So I went with lots of Chaos Res, early damage taken as, and it was actually kind of a thick character for its lower life pool, but it just had guaranteed ignites, it had decent ignite damage and reliable ignite damage. It didn't need to be like ramped, it didn't need to be fished for a high roll or some shit. So that's why it ended up being one of the smoother ignite builds I'd ever played. As well as that, it could make it a pretty fast character because we had flexibility for building a few other things. And it was also just a novelty to be a bit of a hipster build and a purple ignite in this case. It took on most of the Ubers, and usually my ignite builds really start to fall off at the absolute end game. Unless you're playing one of the more busted ignites in the game, they start to just run out of steam. I think it took on most of the Ubers because it's got a very fluid playstyle. It can be defensive, it can be offensive, and just reliable kind of damage through a consistent damage over time ignite. But then on top of that, just having the right amount of defenses to be able to take some hits goes a long way in these Uber fights. As you can see, we've got like glancing blows, I think it is, with a bunch of early damage taken as chaos. And it was a nice change of pace. But it was going to be tough to ever build this character as a replica because it did have a few special pieces of gear. So to go over that just quickly, basically, it was a Devouring Diadem. That's not too hard to get. But I ran an Incandescent Heart with +2 AoE, and then the Forbidden Flesh combo for getting Shaper of Flames. If you're not going to do Shaper of Flames and this sort of concept, you might be able to just do a Pathfinder these days. I doubt that's going to be as good. And even then, I'm not sure what's going to happen with Explosive Concoction with its actual changes. And as well as that, to really ramp your damage in the end game, you kind of have to go high level Awakened Gems. So it's a bit out of, it's tough to build for a certain price range for sure. But for me, overall effectiveness, I think it was pretty good, but not ultimately good. Could have been better on bossing for sure, but clear was amazing, and then bossing was pretty decent. The enjoyment of it, pretty high. Don't love the bossing damage and don't love being throttled on flask charges sometimes. Overall playstyle was pretty good, but I'd played something similar before, so it wasn't as big of a fresh novelty. Still, it was very fun, very high. And then starter, I don't think it could be a starter pretty much at all. But Explosive Concoction Ignite can kind of, in a different way, be a starter, just not the way we're playing it. And then the budget was pretty high in the end, so we've got to give that like a 3, maybe. Yeah, something pretty low, but possible and all that. Kind of expensive, kind of hard to put together, can be substituted for other things. It's a complicated world out there. And in the end, that is a 20. Next build after that was something that is pretty shunned among the community and laughed at, and that is Lightning Tendrils. It came out with an MTX that's kind of cool, kind of fancy. This is the default Lightning Tendrils you're looking at, but there is a nice red automaton zappy style one as well, and I wanted to make a build with it just because I wanted to play around with Tendrils for a while, see how big we can take it, make it, etc. And it was another excuse to play Elementalist with all of the golems. As you can see, lots of little golems following me. They are just used in an Elementalist build pretty strictly for buffs. And once again, crap, Pyro, it's fucking great. What ended up happening, how is it that bad? What ended up happening was a really speedy character with Lightning Warp. I love Lightning Warp as a travel. I love using Lightning Warp in builds that have fast cast speed. I think that's a bit underrated as well. And then a huge amount of single target. So the character is like kind of well-rounded in what it can do for damage and a bit of defense, but the problem is that you become very melee with this playstyle, and it forces you to face tank occasionally. So it can get you into trouble. It can get you killed on some of these really tougher fights, but for the most part, it was an absolute beast at single target the way we built it with a triple damage staff, and it had huge shocks, and we were hitting those really high rolls of 200%, not even 200%. I think it was an alt qual Tendrils that then went into much higher damage ranges, like 600% more on its special hit, something like that. So it was a real surprise package as to how much damage it could do, and I think it took on all Ubers because of that. Occasionally we'd be dying, of course, against some of the tougher stuff, but you can see some of these higher rolls against Uber Cirrus, for example, kill him before he even gets to do anything. And yeah, Tendrils was a surprise package for sure. I didn't think it would do quite as much damage as it does, but it did lend itself to become a bit of a shitty playstyle for melee spell casting. Because not only are you melee, you're also channeling at the same time, so you're locking yourself down, and that means that to solve that, you either have to go extremely defensive or offensive to the point where you are killing something before it gets a chance to do anything. This one was kind of halfway in between both. We could kill things before they'd do anything, except for the Ubers, but then we were defensive enough that we could take some hits some of the time. So that's another Uber that died in just a couple of seconds. Overall, very strong build, but a little difficult to put together, I'd say, to get to the same level of DPS. According to this, our stronger pulses were going up to 100 million DPS. But if you average it out, I think it's supposed to be more like 30 to 40 million DPS, given the stronger pulse ratio and all of that. It did get changed, though, unfortunately. Lightning Tendrils did get changed to some small extent, which means, from memory, I think it's going to be a bit worse, but it depends on how you build it, and it could still be an absolute banger of a skill and build. So the effectiveness of it, being melee kind of sucks, but I mean, it was very effective. It's still hard to get a lot of area on Lightning Tendrils, so Lightning Warp goes around and Orb of Storms does a lot of extra work for the clear, but the area still doesn't scale too high on Lightning Tendrils, which makes it a bit of a problem. The enjoyment is pretty high tier. It was a huge novelty. It's just lightning tendriling things and exploding them for huge amounts of damage. Lightning warping was really fun too. Got to give that a decent amount of enjoyment. Dying to certain Ubers and stuff because your melee wasn't the best, but yeah, as you can see, our character name is pretty limited power because I was not expecting this build to do that much, but in the end, Lightning Tendrils is an absolute beast. Can it be a starter? Can it be sort of budgety? Let me have a quick recap of the gear and stuff. It wasn't anything too special. It was some well-rounded gear, but very attainable stuff. Just a primordial chain, megalomaniac. It was definitely doable, and you just needed the megalomaniacs, I think, to ultimately scale up Tendrils. If I was to do this as a non-elementalist, which would probably be an Inquisitor, just to make things a bit easier, I'd say it would be more budget and starter viable. Either way, I don't think it's too high. Maybe give it a 5. So that ends up being a nice, comfy 22. The next build is another, let's call it a melee build, because it's kind of ranged at times. But what I think has to be given build of the league, and that is Volcanic Fissure. Now that is not something I would have predicted. I didn't think Volcanic Fissure was looking too spicy, and from all the feedback I'd been given by other people that have tried it, it wasn't going to be the best build. But the way I ended up building it and the end result has to be, in the end, given a build of the league. I went with Volcanic Fissure using a one-handed axe as a raider, stacking dexterity for cold damage, and then using Secrets of Suffering to have all types of ailments on it. So that fixes crit, fixes a lot of elemental scaling. And this build was a fast build, a satisfying one to play, and also the most effective one of the league, I think. Because it took on all content, and it was my first build for the league to be able to do 30 waves of Simulacrum. Simulacrum is a very specific sort of challenge, and a lot of the builds that can kill all the Ubers that have like infinite DPS, a lot of the time can't come close to doing Simulacrum, because for a Simulacrum you have to also have a really well-balanced amount of defense. All offense usually isn't going to cut it, all defense isn't really going to cut it because it'll just take you infinity time and that sucks. It has to be a really good balance of both. And this character was, in the end, built really well for its defense. It was built really well for its offense. And it also had really good sustain because Volcanic Fissure acts quite similar to a Molten Strike, where you get a lot of extra projectiles. And if you have life gain on hit with it, then constantly attacking with a decent amount of defense means that you're basically recovering to a point of never dying. So it was a very reliable amount of recovery, and as you can see, the DPS was still pretty good. The only issue with this build was that I was using a synthesized axe that had 2 to 4 cold damage per dexterity, so to exactly replicate and do a build like this one, getting an axe like that is tough. So you could build Volcanic Fissure in many other different ways and still have a similar end result, I think, but this exact build is a tough one to replicate, at least early into a league. By the time I went for this build, I went for the dex stacking situation with the axe, because they were cheap. No one cares about dex stacking axe. It's not a thing. No one made it a thing, and it was like a 40C base. I then got the relic for a bit of extra dex stacking, and it became an absolute huge build. I did have a lot of fun with Volcanic Fissure. I think the way they first tease it and show it off as like this big, slow, two-hander thing just isn't really the way to play it. Like, you can certainly play it, but it isn't going to be the most fun way of playing it, and it just feels like one of those things you'd rather not wait for the travel time and get up in there, become a bit more of a melee build, and then Volcanic Fissure can sometimes take care of a lot of the AoE. So this is one of the uber bosses. I was just limit testing my defensiveness against it, and I could tank stuff that I'm not supposed to be tanking. So overall, just a really effective build and a lot of fun to play. So to give this one a rating, effectiveness, it did everything. It was a huge build, 10. Enjoyment, I had a lot of fun playing it. It was a melee build, but with a lot of speed. And like I've said, people can hate on melee builds all they want, but melee builds right now in modern PoE are some of the best feeling builds in the game up until the Uber challenge. And Ubers are nothing. You don't have to do Ubers. They aren't like on most people's radar. So as long as you can get a melee build to a point where it's covered a lot of its bases, some area, some attack speed, some defense, it's some of the best feeling stuff in PoE. So this technically a 10, and then budget. I think you can start Volcanic Fissure pretty early on. As a raider, as this exact build, obviously copying it is going to be tough. The strength stack Volcanic Fissures are out there. They're easy to copy. They're easy to start. Getting us some attack speed on them is going to be paramount to enjoying them, I think. You can do other variants of stacking elemental damage and stuff. I think it can still be pretty damn cheap to start and doable. I got to give it an 8. You can't really copy this one, but that doesn't matter too much. That needs a total of a solid 28. I'm calling it build of the league, and rightfully so. The next build was yet again another big hipster mess. Thanks to a new item this league, it became viable finally to do Spell Impale. There's been slight instances of Spell Impale in the past, but none of them have been enough to make it worth doing. This time around, there was an item, pair of gloves, that made Spell Impale actually worth looking into, and a lot of different builds crept up that were pure fizz, that with Impale scaling became really viable ways of scaling those spells. I wanted to do a really hipster version, and once again, went into the old hipster pocketbook and got us a replica Tripanon with Sandstorm Visage combo. So Sandstorm Visage was a new item this league as well that gave you crit to your spells based off of your main hand attacks crit chance. Since Tripanon is 100% crit, that means that our build could take care of crit in its entirety just from the combo of hat and weapon. We had 100% crit chance, so then if we put on a Maraline's amulet, our crit would go down by like 40, but then if you get like an extra increased amount of crit, like by 100 or something like that, just global crit chance, you'd go back up to 100% crit and then focus only on crit multi. So I ended up having like 500 crit multi in the build with basically no crit nodes, and lightning warping around with ethereal knives as a Nova, which comes from the helm now instead of a threshold. You can see that what it yielded was a pretty fast playstyle. You had lightning warp that was great. We had a tanky champion, so he didn't have a huge amount of life, but he was tanky in armor, damage reductions, fortify, leech, and life tap as the main source of mana fixing. You can see the damage ended up being pretty damn thick. It was something like 20 million DPS on EK, and EK usually really struggles on single target, so just fixing single target for EK is the big thing that you're supposed to do, because its clear is always going to be pretty nice. So I think this is Uber Eater of Worlds. You can see the DPS is, I mean, it's tough to do against something that's going to kill you all the time and you got to stand still and cast, but it wasn't too bad. Like, for an Uber boss right now, I think this is pretty respectable damage for ethereal knives with some really hipster items. I'm pretty sure it took on all the content in the game, and it was fun to play, zappy, and very unique in what it set out to do and achieved. So ultimately, I was pretty damn happy with this build as well, and I was happy with seeing the proof of concept of Spell Impale finally in the game. And there's definitely big examples of more Spell Impale out there. The biggest one I've seen so far is Shockwave Totems, which are just insane. So to give that one some ratings, effectiveness, I think it was a 10 overall, about as good as things could possibly be. Enjoyment, I did thoroughly enjoy it. Not too sure why it's not maximum. I think by that point I was kind of just not really fully into zapping around and being that speedy, and there's not enough explosion factor in it. Like a real enjoyable Impale build needs some Fizz Explode, which usually comes from a chest, which doesn't really happen anymore. So Impale builds typically feel like they're lacking just a little bit of oomph, I think. And then can it be a starter? I mean, no, it really can't. I don't even know what I can give this. Can it actually have a 0? Quite possibly. I personally don't ever recommend anyone to start Ethereal Knives. A lot of people think it looks cool, and can I do Ethereal Knives as a starter or whatever? And I think starting Ethereal Knives basically ruins your league. Though I do believe people start Ethereal Knives as a Ignite build these days. And maybe that's possible, but I don't know personally exactly how that works out. From my personal experiences, Ethereal Knives starts really poorly. It needs some leveling gear, and it has poor scaling in the early game. And then to go into Impale, it's a very end game setup and item system. And then the hat that I'm using in this build doesn't even exist anymore. So I think I could probably give my first ever 0 for one of these things, which is a bit surprising, but deserved. A 19 in total. The next build was a build that was a bit disjointed because it took a while to play and finish, thanks to starting it in between some events and then in between other games, and it was played over the course of like a month or two. And it was yet another proof of concept of Spellslinger this time around. So I played Spellslinger a couple leagues ago before it got buffed, and I was pretty happy with how Spellslinger performed. And then it got slightly buffed, and I hadn't played it since. So I knew Spellslinger was definitely something that was capable of being put on the table and played at a high level. I wanted to then go ahead and play some Volatile Dead, which I haven't done in a while, and combine it with Trickster and Eternity Shroud. So still add some big hipster elements to it that didn't really matter if I added some cost or not cost, etc. Because it was just a bit of a weird, wacky build that no one really cared to follow anyway. At least to begin with, because Spellslinger, no one thought Spellslinger was shit. But it is. Spellslinger is pretty good. And I think Spellslinger can be starters these days. It scales well. It's just about taking care of like the intricacies of the build, the reservation, the defense, the sustain, all of that. So the way the build works, essentially you have a wand attack, in this case Frenzy. Every time you attack, if you have Spellslinger set up, you'll be casting those spells instead of casting them manually. And here we have Desecrate, and then Desecrate creates corpses that Volatile Dead then pops and goes out and heat seeks missiles. I don't love Volatile Dead personally, but I do think it's a very effective skill, and I like it in some cast on crit setups from time to time. So it was a really effective build in the end. Like I said, it was hard to fully play it through, given that I was playing it over the course of like a month with all these other events happening. But it mapped really well. It got me to like 95, I think it was, did some challenges on it, and did a few Uber bosses. The big concern for me was going to be the single target, but it ended up having decent enough single target that it could take on some Ubers. I think maybe I have some Uber footage at the end. I think maybe I have some Uber footage at the start. I think maybe I don't have any Uber footage. I believe I killed Uber Maven on stream, but never actually put a video for it, is my recollection of the situation. There's our single target. Playstyle was okay for it. But yeah. We'll wrap that up. Have a quick look at the POB for us. Starter VG, Reap. Yeah. I think it was this one, VD Slinger. So it was with Eternity Shroud. Didn't have anything special about the Eternity Shroud. It was just about building the entire set of shaped gear. The hat took a lot of currency. It should only take maybe about 10 to 20 divines to get a reliable outcome on this, but I got a bit unlucky and then it took even more. Aside from that, there was nothing too expensive. It's just shaped gear, which does take a bit of work to put together. But this build doesn't have to run Eternity Shroud. You could very easily go pure fire and do, instead of something meme like this, the usual Secrets of Suffering combo, and that would be just as effective, I think. I then also ended up trying my best to lean heavily into the Chaos thing, which made things more expensive, but that's once again an Eternity Shroud thing. You don't have to do that at all, and probably not even really recommended, because it's extra currency for kind of just hipster's sake. The effectiveness, I think overall it was pretty good. Had a few problems here or there. It wasn't the tankiest build, it could take some hits, but probably needed a bit more single target to be higher on the effectiveness. The enjoyment, it was pretty damn fun to play. Happy with Volatile Dead and Spellslinger. Probably needed an extra explosion or two, aesthetics wise, to be a bit more on the enjoyment scale. But yeah, still pretty high on the enjoyment, honestly. That one was an enjoyable build. And then budget, can it be a starter? Not really, but I do think you can do Spellslinger starters. I do think you can do a Volatile Dead Spellslinger starter. It's just about fixing the right things to get it to come together. So you might be self-cast for a while, because that'll probably just feel better. That's got to be kind of a low score, maybe a bit of a 4. But I do think it's definitely possible. Just not in an Eternity Shroud way. in a more conventional way. Give that a total of a 22. And then the last build of the league is one I managed to just barely squeeze in before the league ended, and it was the one that got me a bunch of challenges done as well, and it was maybe one of the more hipster builds of the league as well. It would have honestly even got build of the league if it was just a little bit more well-rounded on defense and capable of taking on Simulacrum, but because it's not, I think it has to go to Volcanic Fissure. The build in question is Energy Blade cast on crit with Lancing Steel and Eye of Winter. I wanted to do Eye of Winter for a while. It came out with a new MTX. This felt like the excuse to do it. This type of a setup uses Energy Blade to give you a lot of energy shield that you then cut in half, that then gives you a weapon that has a lot of lightning damage. Through that, I then use Battle Mage from the Inquisitor Ascendancy to give my spells lots of lightning damage, and once your spells have lots of lightning damage, you can use whatever spell you want in this type of a setup. Like I said, went Eye of Winter, and I wanted to do Eye of Winter specifically, but you can kind of do and try lots of different skills out and just see where it takes you. I think Eye of Winter did actually end up being one of the stronger setups though, so I was pretty happy with the overall outcome. You had 8,000 energy shield, which could even go higher with a much larger budget. I tried to keep it somewhat budget, and to know more about the build, it's probably worth watching the entire video because it's kind of a mess and does kind of go into lots of detail. The build is a lot of fun to play though, and let me just get to a quick bossing section. And I kind of wish I played it a bit earlier in the league so that I would have got more time to really enjoy it. Once again, another absolutely 0 bitrate build because the MTX shoots out butterflies everywhere, and I'm shooting out like 10 of these Eye of Winters a second, and there's just butterflies everywhere. It's also a bit of a visual nightmare thanks to that, so during some of the boss fights I can't see anything and dodge things in succession because of that. But very strong build, very fun build, achievable with the right uniques. Given enough time into the league, because it would take a little while for these uniques to exist in a cheaper fashion, but pretty reliable outcome because the build itself has a lot of just static items, the types of uniques that you just pick up, put into a build, not too hard to get, not too many rolls on them, and yeah. But the bigger version of the build will in fact get quite a lot bigger if you invest a lot more into it. Took on all the bosses, didn't do a couple of bosses, but overall very powerful build and something I could recommend in the future. Like I said, definitely close to build of the league, but not quite there just because I didn't build it high enough for defense for some of the situations. But 10 on the effectiveness, 10 on the enjoyment, pretty damn fun to put together and play. And then the budget, can it be a starter? Energy Blade is something I don't commonly recommend as a starter. You can get it going with Ghost Wrath, but to get it going with Ghost Wrath and then Battle Mage and a cast on crit setup, definitely tough to do a starter version of something like this. You can, however, start as perhaps Eye of Winter or some sort of spell as an Inquisitor and slowly build into the character, but it's going to be pretty low. I think just to avoid it being a 22, we've got to give it a starter budget of 3. You can play spells, slowly ramp into it, but that's going to have a total of 23. And with that, I think I'm going to close it off. So I think the Sanctum League was pretty damn good. I really enjoyed it. I think it may have been one of the best leagues we've ever had. I played a lot of weird, wacky builds, ones that succeeded. There are a lot of crazy builds out there, crazy build archetypes, and lots of things you can make work, even if people aren't doing them. They don't have to be common, or some streamer doesn't have to go out and tell you to do certain builds to make them viable. As you can see through a lot of the builds I played this league, there's just niche items out there that you gotta go looking for, put together yourself, and yeah, even just something as simple as Spellslinger or certain melee types, they're good. Don't let people tell you they're not unless you try things yourself. Do as much testing as you can. Figure it out whether it's good or bad for yourself, because the results may surprise you. Either way, hope you guys enjoyed the league and the video and all the builds. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in Crucible League.